On this trip, my goal was Lake Mungo, a dry lake on the border between South Australia and Victoria. I was attracted to Lake Mungo on the recommendation of a work colleague. Lake Mungo is a World Heritage listed site due to the incredibly important archaeological finds which has been uncovered from the sand dunes and dry lake bed. If you're watching this footage and thinking, wow, that is one flat landscape, then you'd be right. And in fact, you'd have accurately described most of the road between Canberra and Mildura in Victoria, which was my first destination. With the exception of some bushland and hills, most of the road is across dry, unremarkable country, and I push myself to cross the landscape as fast as possible to get to Lake Mungo. Lake Mungo is notable because of the Mungo Man, which is the nickname given to the remains of a man found in the sand dune along the eastern side of the lake. Mungo Man was buried approximately 42,000 years ago, and this is significant along with other archaeological finds because it is proven that Indigenous Australians have occupied that area for possibly as long as 62,000 years. In addition to Mungo Man, another set of human remains found in the area was nicknamed Mungo Lady. She has been dated as being from a similar period to Mungo Man and shows signs of cremation, making Mungo Lady one of the world's oldest known examples of human cremation and possibly of complex burial rituals among early human societies. The reason for Mungo Lady's cremation is mysterious and the subject of debate. Mungo Lady appears to have died young as 20 years old, and to have been cremated, after which her remains and bones were physically smashed before being burnt a second time and covered with ochre. For those who don't know, ochre is a pigment created from clay. There are 3 local indigenous tribes from the Lake Mungo area. Excuse my pronunciation of these. The Part-Kanti, Nyuyampa, and Muti peoples. In 1992, after lengthy discussion between the elders of these traditional tribal groups, it was decided that Mungo Lady should be brought back to country and reburied. Tanya Charles, a Muti woman, said this about Mungo Lady. Nan started talking about Lady Mungo because of how important it was to have Lady Mungo back here on country because she could feel her spirit all the time. My Nan went and talked to the other elders from the other tribal groups, and that's when they decided that they would put up a big fight to have Lady Mungo return back here to country. If you do visit Lake Mungo, you should take a minute to think about the traditional peoples of the land and the ancient culture that stretches back so far into time's bottomless depths. Colloquial history in the West stretches back maybe 5,000 years. Consider the enormity of time that the traditional peoples of Lake Mungo and the Willandra Lakes area have lived in this area. To get to Lake Mungo, you head 100 kilometers north of Mildura into the outback. And did I mention that it was 100 kilometers of unsealed, corrugated dirt road? I'm not exactly sure what I was thinking tackling this dirt road on a road bike, and it proved to be a big problem. The corrugation mercilessly shook my bike, and I even had bolts coming undone and falling off the bike. The 2 M8 bolts, which held the ignition barrel to the handlebars, fell off my bike without me noticing, and I had to tie the barrel onto the handlebars with zip ties that I had in my toolkit. On top of that, my bike was coated with a thick red dust from the outback. Luckily, I had invested in a Camelback, which is a water bottle that sits in a backpack with a plastic drinking tube attached to the strap over your shoulder. I was able to drink by feeding the tube through the bottom of my helmet. This meant that I didn't have to stop and take my helmet off to drink, and it was a massive help. The temperature must have been close to 30 degrees, and on my previous trips, where I had been sweating inside my motorcycle gear, I would have to make frequent stops to drink and stop myself from dehydrating. This cut down on my travel time considerably, and I was able to ride in hot conditions. It also has the added benefit of making you look like some kind of wasteland survivor from a Mad Max movie. After about 3 hours of bumping along the dirt road, I finally arrived at Lake Mungo. There are two places to camp at Lake Mungo. One is a free camping site, and the other is a paid site, which costs about $10 per night. I chose the paid site so I could have a shower and wash off the dust. Most of the archaeological finds were preserved because when Lake Mungo dried up thousands of years ago, many artifacts and remains were preserved in the mud of the lake bed. One of the most moving experiences I had was seeing the plaster casts of footprints which were found when the wind uncovered the dried lake bed. These footprints were preserved and covered approximately 20,000 years ago. Most interesting were the patterns made by the footprints. The first pattern was of only a left foot, with approximately 3 to 4 meters between each footprint. Between these footprints were small round holes made in the mud. The guide asked my group how they think these footprints were made. My first thought was of a man with a crutch and an injured or perhaps even missing leg. Other theories were some sort of ancient pole vaulting. The guide informed us that this was probably made by somebody in a canoe when the lake bed was shallow. The person would have been sitting or kneeling in the canoe and had a stick in one hand to push the canoe along through the water. Every few meters when the canoe would slow down, they would put their foot down in the shallow water and push off once again. Another set of footprints were a single pair, continuing for a few meters. The footprints then stopped, and two smaller sets of footprints clustered about and ran in every which way direction. This, the guide told us, was where somebody, probably a mother, had carried two children and had stopped and then put them down. The children had immediately started running around in the mud, and these were their footprints. It was strange to see these footprints, which were haphazardly left by ancient people who had probably never dreamed that 20,000 years later, some guy on a motorcycle would take a road trip across the country just to see them. In fact, it's bizarre to think how well the evidence of the past was preserved by the lake, like some massive time capsule, saving the ephemera of ages past to be viewed by future humans. There is something bizarrely intimate about seeing these footprints and the artifacts from the past. Of the artifacts from the past, usually you see stone tools, cave paintings, or human remains, evidence of the past but also distant. These footprints feel like they could have been made yesterday. The sheer expanse of time between when the feet of ancient humans left these impressions in the mud and when I stood looking down at the castings of these footprints is staggering, and it makes you feel so small compared with the distance across time, but oddly in touch with these people as well. On the eastern side of the lake there is a long sand dune running across the horizon, generally known as the Walls of China, but also sometimes called the lunette for its crescent shape. The Walls of China are the white curved line in the photo below. The story behind the name of the sand dune comes from the shearers who worked at Mungo Station in the past. These shearers were white Australians, most likely descended from European or English migrants, but there were also Chinese workers brought in because they were cheap labor. In the heat of the day, often Chinese laborers would sit in the shade of the shearing shed and look out across the dry lake bed at the dunes, from which from a distance looked like a vast white wall. Some snarky shearer commented that it must remind the Chinese workers of the Great Wall of China, and so the name stuck. Although you can note that the dunes are called the Walls of China, not the Wall of China. You can walk along the sand dunes only with a tour guide, and tours run daily from the visitor center. Being on the sand dunes themselves is quite eerie. As I was on the tour, dark, billowing clouds crept across the sky, and towards the end of the tour, heavy raindrops began to fall. By the time we got back to the campground, it was raining heavily. I had planned to head back to Mildura that afternoon, but I thought I'd wait until the rain ends. In most of Australia, Rain usually pours for only an hour or so and then dries up. After 2 hours, the rain was letting up, but it was still coming down, and I felt that I may as well head off and not worry too much about getting a bit wet. I packed up my tent, put on my wet weather gear, and headed out. The dirt road on the way out from Lake Mungo had turned to mud, and while it was still mostly firm, as I got further out from the camp, the mud became deeper, and I started seeking out the firm parts of the road to avoid the parts that looked soft. Pretty soon the whole road looked soft, and my wheels were sinking more and more into the mud. I got bogged at a particularly bad part of the road and sat thinking what to do. Luckily, a four-wheel drive came up the road before long, and they helped me to push my bike out. I thought better of the plan to head back to Mildura though, since all the road that was in sight was muddy and boggy. I asked the campers from the four-wheel drive how far the mud went on for, and they said it was only for another 2 kilometers or so, and that this was the worst part of it. It was late in the evening, however, and I decided to head back to camp and wait until the next day. I had hoped that the sun would come out and dry the road, but it rained lightly throughout the night, and the next morning was overcast and cold. The road was still muddy, but I managed to get through the mud without getting bogged. Just as the campers had said, the mud all but dried up about 2 kilometers away from camp, and the rest of the trip back to Mildura was easy, apart from the corrugated road. Lake Mungo had been the main goal of my trip, and I had scheduled a week and a half for the trip, but I had made Lake Mungo in only 3 days, and I spent 1 day there. Now I was headed back to Mildura, and I had no idea what to do after that. I could go back to Canberra, but this trip really hadn't scratched my itch for travel just yet. After looking around the visitor centre, I found a brochure for the Flinders Ranges. I had heard the name before, but never actually read much about the ranges. After looking at some of the pictures, I knew that this was where I wanted to go. The Flinders Ranges looked to be about 2 more days' ride west. On the way, the Murray River crossed my path. Where I'm from, most rivers aren't much more than streams, and often they don't even have flowing water unless it's after rain. The Murray River impressed me though. It was huge and wide, and the bush on the sides of the river was calm and quiet. It might be hard to believe for people not from Australia, but I had actually never seen an emu in the wild before I took this trip. When I first saw an emu in a paddock on the side of the road, I was incredibly excited. I thought I must be seeing something rare. Surely emus are rare birds, right? As I continued deeper into rural Victoria and South Australia, I saw another, and then a flock of about 20 emus all together. And suddenly I realized that emus must be fairly common in this part of Australia. In fact, emus turned out to be almost as common as kangaroos are in the Hunter Valley, which is where I'm from. The Flinders Ranges sits north of Adelaide. It's a mountain range of red rocks and gorges and towering bluffs. I reached the ranges just as the sun was setting. If you pass through the ranges when the sun is low, you'll see the enormous shadows cast by the hills. The next morning when I started out, I was treated to the contrast in light that the early morning sun paints on the landscape. One of the first places I visited in the ranges was called the Sacred Valley, which was a deep rock gorge carved by running water, where there were ancient carvings left by the indigenous tribes of the area. These carvings hadn't been dated, but they indicate lore about places with water and coverings from the wind, as well as information about where various animals are found. After walking through the valley, I walked to the top of a nearby hill, which gave an excellent panorama of the surrounding mountain ranges. I continued on through the ranges, admiring the scenery. Blinman is the last town on the Flinders Ranges Way, which is the road that traverses the length of the southern mountain ranges. North of Blinman, the road becomes an unsealed dirt track. Blinman has 2 pubs and a cafe/bakery, and several buildings kept in the colonial style of 200 years earlier for tourists to visit. I stopped here for lunch and a coffee. When I went back to my bike, I happened to glance down at the chain. I had checked the chain before I had left Canberra, and I had the right amount of slack, about 3 centimeters of wiggle room. When I checked the chain now, about 1,000 kilometers later, it was really loose. Like, really loose. It was almost coming off the sprocket. I went into full panic mode. If the chain fell off the sprocket while I was riding, it could get tangled and jam the axle, causing a major accident. I was in the middle of nowhere, and it was unlikely in the extreme that somebody around here would have a new chain that would fit my bike. I had never replaced the chain while I had owned the bike, and God knows how long the chain was on the bike before I bought it. I had adjusted the chain before I left Canberra, but the side arms of my rear wheel were pretty much fully extended just to keep the chain taut, and this was before I rode another 1,000 kilometers. This was a real amateur mistake, but I am an amateur. So I weighed my options. I could spend the whole day asking around and trying to find a mechanic. In the end, I decided that my best option was to ride back the way that I had come and hope to get to Hawker, which was the nearest town, before the mechanic closed, if Hawker actually had a mechanic at all. It was the 24th of April, and if I couldn't find a mechanic open today, then there was no way I'd be able to find one that would be open on Anzac Day. For non-Australians who don't know, Anzac Day is a national holiday commemorating the storming of Gallipoli by the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps during World War II. Anzac Day is a big deal in Australia, and almost no shops are open, let alone a mechanic, so my time was pretty limited. I decided that if the chain was going to come off my bike while I was riding, it would be better for it to come off while I was riding slow. So I left Blinman riding at a snail's pace. A few kilometers outside Blinman, I couldn't believe my luck. I found a mechanic, and not just any mechanic, a motorcycle mechanic. I hadn't seen this sign on the way into town because it was facing in the opposite direction. And just to show you that I'm not joking, here is Blinman on the map. Port Augusta is the nearest big town, which is about 150 kilometers away. Hawker might have had a mechanic, but it was still 100 kilometers away. Now here is the mechanic I found. You can barely make out the sign that says Flinders Motorcycle Services. Apparently the Flinders Ranges is actually a pretty popular spot for dirt biking. Popular enough, at least, to warrant a part-time mechanic who stays up there. I pulled up the driveway and around to the back of the house, where 5 or so cars were parked. I walked around to the back gate and found 6 older men sitting around in camping chairs under the veranda of a sandstone cottage with a corrugated iron roof. There was a curved bit of sheet metal half buried in the dirt with a small fire burning on top. Let me paint you a picture. People dress differently in the country, especially older generations. People almost always wear farm boots with elastic sides and wool socks, and lots of farmers wear long-sleeved flannel shirts, polo shirts, or singlets. They also wear blue cotton shorts, which are quite small, that are usually called stubbies. People often commonly wear bucket hats or old worn felt hats or even akubras. All these guys were dressed pretty much like this. I walked into the backyard and asked if they were open today because I had a problem with my bike. It turned out that two of these guys were mechanics. One owned this workshop and another owned another mechanic business in a nearby town. I filled them in on the problem and asked whether they had a spare chain I could put on my bike. The owner said that they didn't, at least not for a road bike. We talked a bit and they asked me about whether my bike had a master link on the chain or if it had a clip. Basically, there are two ways to connect motorcycle chains: riveting the chain together and clipping the chain together. If a chain is riveted together, then you need a special tool called a chain breaker to break the master link and get the chain off, and you also need more tools to put it back together again. If the chain had a clip, then it's much easier to work with. Their plan was to remove a link from my chain so that it was shorter and tighter around the sprockets. They told me that if my chain had a riveted master link, I was pretty much screwed because they didn't have the tools to change it. But they said to bring the bike around and they'd take a look anyway. I held my breath to see how this would turn out because I had no clue what the hell was happening. Luckily, it turned out that my bike has a clip-on master link and they could work with it. There was one guy there who owned a motorcycle shop in a town called Clare. I think his name was Bob. He was a natural showman and he immediately launched into an explanation of how to change the chain on a motorcycle. He took out an angle grinder and had quickly grinded off the rivets on one of the links of my chain. He then took off the clip on the master link and in a few seconds had shortened the chain and reattached the link. Being all set now, I asked how much I owed them and the owner said $40. I actually only had $20 in my wallet and I said I'd head back to town to grab some more cash and be back. Meanwhile, Bob was chiding his friend for charging me anything since he said that he had done all the work. Half joking and half serious, Bob said that he shouldn't charge me anything. The owner begrudgingly said that he'd take $20 and that I shouldn't worry about going back into town. After that, I shook hands with them and told them how grateful I was and headed off. Looking back, I really can't believe my luck. Without these guys sitting around a fire at a small sandstone cottage in the middle of the Flinders Ranges, I would have been totally screwed. Who knows how things might have turned out. I might have had an accident when my chain came off my bike while I was trying to find a mechanic, so everything turned out pretty well. So this is really the end of the video. Nothing much else happened on my trip. I pretty much just headed back to Canberra. If you like this video, have a look at some of my other videos or share them with a friend.